Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to call the program to order. We acknowledge the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. My name is Richard Joy, and this dinner is a wonderful representation about what the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, is all about. Bringing the broadest array of real estate and land use professionals together across both the private and public sectors to provide the leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating and sustaining communities worldwide. And tonight is especially about the public sector side of this equation. As mentioned, Meet the Chiefs was designed to celebrate the senior planners whose leadership literally shapes our region. With over 40 public sector leaders in attendance tonight, I'm not going to introduce them all individually, but I would like to recognize them at this moment with a round of applause, and hopefully that'll get people quiet. I gotta start with the round of applause next time. I'd also like to thank our 30-plus dinner sponsors whose generous support had us hanging up the sold-out sign a month in advance once again this year. Amazing. Thank you. A very, very special thanks, especially to WSP and our presenting and our dinner sponsor, WSP, and our presenting sponsor, Pearson, the GTAA, who've supported this event since its inception. Thank you. And now I really am going to ask everybody to be quiet because I need to make sure that my boss, the ULI chair, the principal and co-founder of Quadrangle, is now going to come to the stage. Les.
Is it any wonder that nothing ever gets done in this city? You get 400 people in one room and they all just want to talk. Anyway, thank you very much, Richard. On behalf of ULI Management Committee, which is really our board of directors, it's my pleasure to join Richard in welcoming you to our 5th annual Meet the Chiefs dinner, my first as ULI Toronto District Council Chair. Approaching 2,000 members, we are now one of the largest districts in the ULI Global Network, almost triple our size from 5 years ago. Over the next year, our goal is to continue to grow our regional membership to 3,000 members, which would make us the largest ULI chapter in the world. Apart from bragging rights, and there's nothing wrong with bragging rights, a large network translates to more and more value to our members and our sponsors. Importantly, a major factor in our growth has been our widening presence in the entire Greater Golden Horseshoe, as well as within the public sector, 2 important features of this evening as we celebrate civic leadership across all levels of government. If you are not already a member, please do consider becoming one. There's a treasure trove of networking, thought leadership, and international case study all lurking behind our online member paywall. And watch for more and more members-only events in the coming year. As they say, membership has its privileges. I'm also very excited that this evening launches our countdown to the Urban Land Institute's spring meeting in May 2020, just 13 months from now. For the first time ever, this major convention will bring 4,000 plus industry and public sector leaders from across North America and internationally to Toronto, a major opportunity for us to showcase our entire region, our people, and our global companies. Richard will have some more details to share after dinner, but now it is my pleasure to announce publicly the 4 co-chairs of our Spring 2020 host committee. I want, if you can hold your applause, but Ted Wilcox, the Global Head of Asset Management for Manulife John Hancock, Amy Erickson, Principal and Managing Director of Avison Young, Godine Sibay, Managing Director for the Ontario region of McCarthy-Tétrault, and Ken Tannenbaum, Vice Chairman of the Kilmer Group. Please give them a round of applause. We're very excited to have attracted such high-powered leadership to such an important regional milestone event. We will now pivot to our main program for this evening. I'd like to call my ULI executive team colleague, Hilary Marshall, to the podium. Hilary is Vice Chair of ULI Toronto and also Vice President of the GTAA Pearson Airport, who is tonight's presenting sponsor. Hilary will introduce our keynote speaker. Hilary.
Hello, everyone. You're behaving better, so I won't have to call you to heel. Les, thanks very much. On behalf of Toronto Pearson, it's our great pleasure to support this important celebration of public sector regional leadership. From its onset, the idea for this event was a perfect fit for our airport, given our role in the region, and we're pleased to be back again to support tonight's dinner. Under the leadership of our CEO, Howard Ng, Pearson has put the broader growth, development, and economic prosperity of the Greater Golden Horseshoe at the center of our strategic planning of the airport's future. As our metropolitan region grows, it's increasingly clear that Pearson must serve as more than an aeronautical hub. We also must become a mass transit hub to serve the entire region. And we're making good progress on that front with today's provincial announcement that the Crosstown West LRT is going to come to Pearson. Thanks, Richard. Our future and the future of the region are linked together. Indeed, Pearson's strategic importance to the broader national economy, a single hub that connects single nonstop flights to over two-thirds of the world's GDP, is increasingly evident. So let me roll this video and tell you more about it.
What we're dealing with in North America is economies that are largely mature economies, that are growing less rapidly, and that if we want to grow our businesses, we have to seek out markets in Asia or in South America or in other parts of the world. It is vital to be able to visit suppliers or to visit with customers or to bring people in or to move your goods and services on a very timely basis. Pearson creates a hub which draws investment into Canada and makes it much easier as well for businesses that are here to be able to service customers around the world. When you take a look at what a great airport does, it creates a piece of infrastructure that draws business and enables business to be far more competitive. And this is what Pearson does for Canada. Yes, the impact regionally, locally is very significant, but more important than that is it's an enabler for us to attract investment from abroad and for Canadian businesses to be able to compete and succeed in a dramatically globalizing world economy.
We're also proud of Pearson, so thanks for your support tonight. Thanks to Richard and the team here at ULI for continuing to be a great partner. We really appreciate it. So here's what I'm here to do tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Doug Saunders. Doug is an author, journalist, and consultant of Canadian and British citizenship. Do you speak with a pretty accent? Okay, maybe not so pretty. He's the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail and the author of a number of books, The Arrival City, The Final Migration, and Our Next World, Myth of the Muslim Tide, and Maximum Canada. Great title. In his most recent book, Maximum Canada, Why 35 Million Canadians Are Not Enough, that sets the context for our interest in having Doug speak tonight. Doug argues that Canada's economic viability demands that we triple our population growth by the end of the 21st century, a more aggressive trajectory than we're currently on. What does the Greater Golden Horseshoe need to be prepared for such growth? Well, let's get Doug up here and find out the answer to that. Doug Saunders.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you, everybody, for coming on this exciting day for planners, I imagine. I've run into a number of people who are delighted to find that at some point during this century, they may have a subway station in their municipality for the first time. It's a real honor and pleasure to be speaking to this audience. I'm a true child of the greater Golden Horseshoe area. I was born in Hamilton to a family that is spread across what is now the 905 and the 519, and I've spent about the half of my life that I've spent living in Canada, I've spent in this region, riding GO trains back and forth and wishing there were more subway stations and that sort of thing. So, and I think I'm speaking to an audience, a lot of whom both intuitively and empirically understand what I'm talking about when I say that this isn't real. The book I've written isn't really a book about calling for a specific population for Canada, more recognizing that we have a history of not really being ready for population growth that does occur, and that a lot of our problems and our growth pains in our cities are not problems of overpopulation, they're problems of underpopulation and insufficient population density. It's not the 19th century anymore. We don't need more people in Canada to add bodies to factories and fields and armies and that sort of thing. But we do need to recognize that we don't have the right concentrations of people in the right places to do the right things in order to be competitive economically, in order to have the markets and audiences we need to be culturally independent, in order to have the population base we need to make a transition to a green economy, and in order to have a sustainable population for the future. So I'm going to take a look at a little bit about our history of not being quite ready for people when they arrive and understanding it. And I'm going to start in an odd place, which is this painting. I've always thought Lauren Harris's paintings of cities were his best work. And he did a lot of great works of Toronto garage laneways and that sort of thing. But this whole series has always intrigued me because it shows a Toronto that I didn't recognize. When I first saw these paintings decades ago, I remember thinking, these are nice, but where the hell is that? It says spring on the outskirts. That sure isn't Steeles Avenue. Or January thaw, edge of town. What edge of town is that? These look like slum shacks in Mumbai or something like that. And in fact, in terms of architecture and the people living in them and the way they were planned and developed, they were. These sort of shacks were a huge proportion of the population of Toronto a century ago. And understanding how these shack-town neighborhoods formed and came to dominate Toronto helps understand our history of not really, first of all, not really being ready. Second of all, growing from the outside in, which is another big thing in the history of this region. And third, and I think maybe most importantly for today, recognizing that what happens to this region often is based on decisions that happen at the federal level and sometimes the provincial level, with the municipal level having to deal with the manifestations of those policy decisions. So the policy decision I'm talking about was the series of immigration drives Canada had between about the 1860s and the 1950s. Now, we like to think that Canada grew essentially like US cities did, with lots of people immigrating to downtown cores and spreading out radially and into the suburbs. But this region didn't really grow or develop that way to the same extent. Yes, there's a scene like this in 1900 on Yonge Street, but what actually happened was Canada was very different from the United States. In those big immigration drives, the agents we sent out all around Britain and Europe with the carts with sheafs of wheat painted on the sides and all that, and the free land we offered, they were under specific instructions under Macdonald, under Laurier, under Borden, under Mackenzie King, to attract a certain sort of person to Canada. And they were told that what Canada wanted was farmers, agricultural laborers, and to a much lesser extent, female domestic servants, because we were not an urban country, and we did not want our cities to grow. That was a very explicit instruction. And that if you had entrepreneurial ambitions, or you had an advanced education or a profession, or an intention to go into business, you were told maybe the United States is more for you. We want to populate the plains, we want to populate the fields. And so Canada's population grew, but it didn't grow very much. Most decades in Canada's first century, Canada lost more people leaving for the United States than it gained from immigration. By the end of the Second World War, Canada had gained 7.6 million people through immigration, and it had lost, I think, 7.2 million from leaving for the United States. But it also, fortunately, 70% of those people who were brought over to be farmers either gave up farming very quickly and moved to the cities, or they never bothered farming in the first place, and they went straight to the cities. And they proved quite adept at building an urban economy and industries in things other than agriculture. And I think of my great-grandfather, who came from Europe at the very beginning of the 20th century and got some of that free land just outside of Calgary, and lasted about 2 years until he realized there wasn't really much of an agricultural economy. You couldn't get loans from the banks. You couldn't sell your wheat to England at anything like half the rate the Americans could sell it to other countries. And he gave up and he moved to Hamilton, Ontario, in what may have been one of these self-built settlements. So people were flooding into the GTAH in the late 19th and early 20th century, unanticipated by federal, provincial, or municipal governments. And they were doing what people in a lot of parts of the world do. They were going to farmers, talking them into subdividing their land on the edge of town, paying them cash, and building their own shacks with tin plate like these ones, or this one's made of soap boxes. These are all located in what is now known to most people as the city of York, in Etobicoke. But the geographer Richard Harris said in the 1990s that a third of the population of Toronto in 1920 were living in these self-built slum shack towns on the edge of town. And other economists and analysts say it may be closer to half of Toronto's population. I mean, these were regarded as a scandal in the newspapers, the shack town slums that were overtaking the entire city. But they were the form of growth that took place. These ones are in Hamilton because they were built all the way around the harbor by people coming under similar circumstances. Unanticipated, not planned, not part of the grid of streets. Their frontages were normalized in the 1930s and 1940s, and I think the last vestiges of this form of development were finally dealt with after Hurricane Hazel wiped out a number of shack towns and their occupants in the early 1950s. So we're left with the legacy of that form of development, where Canada did not expect really until after the Second World War to be a country of cities. And our cities developed by accident. And we have a shape, particularly Toronto, which was never expected to be the major city of Canada or of Ontario. And I've often said Toronto is unusual among cities of its type in that it really developed from its suburbs inward rather than from its core outward. A lot of its suburbs developed earlier than the city did. The Golden Mile existed many years before the subway existed. And we're faced with the shape of that across the region in some ways. Now, the next period of big growth, of course, was the post-war decades, and planning was smarter. And yet it still tended to be catch-up planning to a large extent. land use planning was a little more forward-looking, particularly in the development of the suburbs. The Greater Toronto area is kind of unique in having higher density suburbs than other countries, than other cities of its sort, because there was thought given not to population density or diversification, but to economic mix, socioeconomic mix. There were, as many of you know, there were requirements to have rental units in the suburbs in growth plans of the 1950s and 1960s, and that resulted in what I call Canada's most distinctive form of housing, the form of housing that's most uniquely Canadian, which is not the Victorian Bay and Gable or something like that, but is the slab farm in the suburbs. There's 2,000 of these buildings in the suburbs of Toronto alone. We're one of the very few countries in the world that has a huge stock of apartment buildings in the suburbs. These are where immigration takes place. They're all privately owned, they're all rental, and they do give our suburbs a population density that's higher than other places, but is not high enough to support the sorts of public transit, the sorts of a transition to green economy that we need. There are real social problems with these types of developments in that the empty spaces between them create a much lower population density than is desirable. There's no space for people to do the immigrant thing and start a small business in their own residential area. There's no middle class people walking past with money in their pocket to go to your little shop or restaurant. And it's a particularly gendered form of isolation in that women who come to Canada and end up living in these developments find it's terrifying to cross this empty expanse at night, particularly in January, and they end up separated from each other. So there's a whole set of social and psychological problems caused by the legacies of growth that did not expect the sort of people. Nobody expected these to be the places where most immigration took place. People thought that these would be automobile-driven developments for factory workers. Yet there's been a shift in both the types of immigration to Canada and in the structure of the labor market that means that it's people without cars, starting with high educations, starting at the bottom of the income ladder, living in these places. So these backgrounds are all by way of saying that we're never quite ready for the growth that occurs. The audience I'm speaking to, I think, probably is the most sophisticated group of people in terms of understanding population growth projections in Canada. The federal government has a number of departments that do population growth projections. Provincial governments have departments that do, but they don't speak to each other and they don't coordinate. And when they talk about infrastructure plans, they don't coordinate them with the long-term population growth vision. And when I look for sophisticated projections of population growth, I see them at the municipal level. That doesn't mean they necessarily translate into reality, though, easily. I mean, today's announcement of the new transit lines left a lot of people here very excited because you're getting subway stations in some of your municipalities for the first time. You're getting connections, but that's a catch-up proposal to deal with the population growth that occurred in the 1990s and 2000s, and that might be finished by the end of the 2030s. We're not looking at this. This region's population is going to double and probably triple by the end of this century, and we're not ready for it. But I think a lot of people here also understand that the problems of this region are often problems not of overcrowding or of overpopulation, but they're problems of low population density. Toronto, you see where Toronto fits on this chart, right near the bottom, the lower third, population density of 4,457 people per square kilometer, which is a third of London's, for example. It's interesting to see that Mississauga has a population density that's not that much lower than Toronto's on this ranking, which indicates a couple of things. It indicates that Toronto has a lot of room to grow, and that Mississauga has become much more of a city than a suburb. But we have to understand that regardless what the policies are at the national level, there is probably going to be a lot of population growth in this part of Canada over the rest of this century. I would say even if there's a political development which causes people to vote for a party that completely wants to end immigration, as we have seen in some other countries, that will not actually affect those population growth projections in the medium term. So here's Canada's immigration rate over the last century and a half. That dark line is the immigration rate, the number of immigrants per thousand population. As you can see, that period when the shack towns were dominating Toronto's population was the one era of mass immigration that Canada has really experienced, the Laurier era. If we were to have Laurier level immigration to Canada now, we'd have 2 million people per year almost coming into the country. Even the most radical suggestions sort of call for a gradual ramping up to 450,000. Our immigration rate has remained fairly stable since the end of the 1980s at around 8 immigrants per 1,000 population. It recently has gone up somewhat to, I think, 8.9, which is the biggest increase in quite some time. Generally speaking, and partly because of a recognition of coming demographic pressures. I mean, right now, every federal government looks at the fact that right now there's 4 working age people paying taxes into the system to cover the costs of one retirement age person. By the end of the 2030s, there will be only 2 working age people in Canada to pay for those costs. And the fiscal math and what you're gonna have to cut to pay for that makes even fairly conservative immigration skeptical governments more favorable. Another important thing to look at on this chart, though, is that the immigration rate doesn't tend to correspond to the politics of who's in power federally. Look at the 1990s. Jean Chrétien made a big effort to try to increase Canada's immigration level to 300,000 in the early 1990s. What you see happening there is it went down because Canada's economy was tanking. And when Canada's economy is doing badly, people don't come. And he was unable to raise it to the level that he wanted to. If you look at the end of the 1950s, John Diefenbaker became very unhappy about immigration. He realized it wasn't the people he wanted to be coming to Canada, but it was a lot of Italians. And very explicitly tried to put an end to that. And that didn't work because the economy was booming, because even part of his cabinet were Italian, and the immigration rate was not affected by that, and so on. So generally, when the economy, nature abhors a vacuum. When the economy is doing well, people come. And that's been the story in this region as well. When things are going well economically, the population grows regardless of what the politics or policies are. When things are going badly, people don't come. And I should say, regardless of what housing prices are as well, which is one of the paradoxes of these things, is that immigrants want to settle in places where they can't afford the housing. And when I've done research work for international organizations on how immigrants choose what neighborhoods and what cities to settle in, and they're always looking for 3 things. First of all, known, and this is true if they're refugees, economic immigrants, first of all, known economic or business opportunities, and increasingly that's not a job in a factory. Increasingly that means the ability to start a small business and employ some people. Second of all, networks of people from a similar background who can loan you money and help you start your business and get you a place to sleep at first. And third of all, housing that you can afford. And the one thing that will always cross off the list if the other 2 are available is the third thing. And so we have to realize that rising housing costs and difficulties of purchasing housing will not reduce the demand from newcomers coming in. And what we found also is that it doesn't dramatically reduce the rate of home ownership among immigrants. It's still almost half of immigrants to Canada buy a house within, I think, 10 years of arriving here. It just means they're going into usurious levels of debt, often franchised across multiple branches of their family, and that sort of thing. So this is, a lot of you have seen this. This is the Toronto CMA, which is a lot like the GTA, but slightly smaller population growth projection, which by the end of the 2030s will go from something like 6 million now to 9 million. That projection, which gets thrown around a lot, is based on 2011 statistics, though, that did not anticipate the increases in immigration, and I would say that it's probably going to go quite a lot higher. And that adds up to us being able to expect this region's population to double by the end of this century. But where is it going to happen? This is another map that you all know very well of the Greater Golden Horseshoe area and where the population growth is taking place right now, the darker colors being the higher population growth. It's a little bit misleading because of the problem of percentages and numerators and denominators. Toronto appears to have a fairly low population growth rate of less than 5.5%, but of course when you're growing by 4% on 3 million, it's still a huge amount of the share of people being added to the place. So hundreds of thousands of people are being added to Toronto's population. But part of what I would like to point out is that Toronto is seeing less of the projected population growth because its areas of low population density, and this is true of a lot of the region, are inaccessible to increases in population. The places where people should be settling are not the places where people are settling. Now, immigration is being driven to the outer suburbs, partly because the outer suburbs have become a better deal and better market, and because they have the post-secondary institutions that are desirable, but also very largely because places that still have a lot of room for people have become politically inaccessible to population growth, to new housing, to the sort of things, to the sort of density increases that could lead to green transitions and public transit and things like that. And this is another map many of you know, the population density map. And what's interesting, again, is the concentrations of fairly high density in what used to be considered the bedroom communities, and now in Peel, and now our independent cities in Peel and York regions. But of course, the other thing being the areas of shockingly low population density between the downtown core of Toronto and those outer suburbs. And this is what's been called by some people the yellow belt, because that's the color it is on all the land use planning maps. And a lot of housing activists like to show this map now, but it illustrates a problem that many North American cities have, which is that the areas where people, the areas that are most accessible by public transit and things like that, that should be the places where new Canadians are settling and so on, are not the places where you can add people. So those places zoned yellow are single-family detached zoned, and they're very rigidly controlled that way and inaccessible to increases in density because of land use, the development approval processes, and things like this. And what's most alarming about this is that the places, and I'm showing Toronto, but this is true in other parts of the region as well, the places that suffer from this problem the most of locked-in lack of progress in development are the places that are now having declining populations. Half of the neighborhoods in the GTH area, so half of the land with housing on it in the GTH area is right now experiencing declining population. And just one second, I'm gonna grab a number here. I suppose I can talk while I'm going to the table like a rock star. I should be crowd surfing or something like that. So 58% of the land mass in the GTAH has lost population since 2001, so not half of it. Almost 6 in 10 neighborhoods in our region have lost population since 2001. So the areas that have grown in population the population is going up, but the areas that have grown in population have gained 1.9 million people. But 60% of the land mass has lost almost 500,000 people because of this. And unfortunately, this has led to school closings, things many of you know about, dead communities where innovation doesn't happen, where a transition to carbon neutral economies is impossible. A third of households in Toronto have only one person in them, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You want to be welcoming students, you want to be welcoming people who are single-person households, but unfortunately that third of households with only one person in them are concentrated in that single-family detached house belt that's suffering population decline. So we're seeing a hollowing out of the neighborhoods that should be the sources of population growth. These are the places where the next immigration wave should be settling down, should be occurring, where new Canadians are settling, but they're blocked. And we still have a locked-in process that leaves these places with residential detached zoning really unable to even add a duplex or a garage conversion or something like that in it. I mean, the barriers that we're hearing from people to doing that are worse than in other cities. Cities like Surrey have been able to get through those barriers and create extra density by allowing houses to be turned into multiplexes and that sort of thing. The barriers in Ontario are bad, and they've gotten worse exactly when we need to be getting through those barriers. So Toronto is sort of the textbook example of what the American planner Daniel Paralek calls the missing middle. There's a lot of that stuff on the left, the detached single-family homes. There's a decent amount of stuff on the right, the condo apartment developments and the fairly high density stuff. But all of that stuff in the middle, duplexes and triplexes and live-work developments and bungalow courts and one or two-story apartment developments, there just aren't any of those. They were a very common form of building in the middle of the 20th century in this part of Ontario, and they're very hard to develop now. So this sort of thing, which is a couple blocks from me, was something that you saw going up a lot in between about 1900 and 1950. The building on the left probably contains between 2 and 4 people in a nice house. The building on the right, an equally nice house, contains 6 apartments. I think 4 of them are 3-bedroom and 2 of them are 2-bedroom. I've seen other units look identical that contain 12 apartments on the same land footprint. That is absolutely impossible to do in Toronto. It's difficult to do in other parts of the region. And it means that we have this resource of low population density, and we have complaints from people in this area about feeling crowded. We were just talking about this with a couple people beforehand, that when you live in a lot of parts of the Golden Horseshoe and you're stuck in traffic on the highway, it feels like it's overcrowding that's leaving you stuck in the traffic jam, whereas in fact it's low population density that's leaving you in the traffic jam, because there just aren't enough neighborhoods around you with the sufficient population density to justify the types of rapid public transit and things like that make it possible, and that leaves it feeling stuck. That feeling of being stuck in downtown Toronto, which I think has gotten a lot worse in the last few years, is a consequence of low population density in large parts of the neighborhood. So let me talk finally, to wrap up, about what we need to do, and by we I mean federal, provincial, and municipal governments and the private sector, if we really want to get ahead of the coming doubling and possibly tripling of the population of the region. Because our population tripled between 1945 and 2015. Canada's population tripled, and this region's population probably more than tripled. And we didn't expect it. It was nobody in 1945 thought, people in 1945 said, if Canada's population goes above 20 million by the end of this century, we're going to be in huge trouble. We'll run out of food. We'll have horrible, violent ghettos like the Americans. We'll lose our culture. And of course, our population tripled, and the opposite of all those things happened. But we got lucky. Our population tripled, but we had The right housing at the right prices, in the right neighborhoods, in the right jobs, in the right places, for the right people at the right time. We were lucky that a lot of middle-class people had moved out of the inner cores of cities to the suburbs, leaving a cheap housing stock available that people were able to use as social capital to build their families and invest. We are not going to be that lucky over the next 60 years as our population doubles and potentially triples. So my core argument in this book and to you is that we have to stop expecting to get lucky and we have to start getting skilled. We have to start planning ahead for population growth that's going to happen. We need to plan infrastructure. We need to get provincial and federal governments not to look at infrastructure as a way to get votes in desirable ridings. We need to get provincial and federal governments not to announce infrastructure to deal with population growth that happened 2 decades ago, but to start anticipating for 50 years ahead. We need to start planning for a green transition. Canada is far from a carbon neutral economy, and the largest share of Canada's carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, come from what basically could be called inefficient urban living. Private automobile transportation in urban areas is the biggest. Heating of single-family houses, often with one person living in them, that were not built with anything like a green building code, is another one. The inability to shift neighborhoods to structures that are built using green building techniques is another. The use of energy and energy distribution systems that are obsolete is the other one. Those things altogether mean that a shift to smart planning, smart density in cities is the core thing to Canada making a green transition. We need planning for that population growth to ensure that people are not just randomly scattering across the landscape and placing further demands on infrastructure, but are concentrating in the places where they want to. 60% of immigrants to Canada now have university degrees. That's twice the rate that Canadian-born people have university degrees. They want education. They want to be developing technology and new businesses. They want to become employers, not employees. We need to develop places that can become hubs of innovation and activity, which is why one of my big arguments is that it's the so-called second-tier cities that have post-secondary institutions that are going to become the big immigration targets to the extent that they're not now. It's the Hamiltons, Kitchener-Waterloos, Londons, St. Catharines, Kingstons that are going to be the places where new Canadians want to settle because they need a couple years of it post-secondary to upgrade their credentials. They need housing they can afford. They need communities that want them. And so it's welcoming to see public transit developments happening in places like Kitchener-Waterloo and Hamilton to anticipate population growth that is going to happen in the future, but there needs to be a lot more of that sort of thing to create these hubs of where the Silicon Valleys of Canada are going to be, the Cambridge Massachusetts of Canada are going to be during the coming century. And of course, we need to talk about housing. We have a housing supply crisis. Every country in the developed world and a lot of the middle-income countries have severe housing supply crises. These are big problems in the world. These are not problems of running out of land or of speculation in the market. These are problems of politics and political barriers to the development of housing. There are a lot of people who want to build housing. There are a lot of people who want to buy housing. There are political barriers to the creation of the housing that's needed. And the one thing to close that I think is fortunate in this is that I think we're starting to see a political shift among voters and people who live in neighborhoods who a decade ago, if you told them that the place next door to them was going to become a sixplex like I showed you, they would have thought, oh God, a bunch of weirdos from outside of town or out of the country are going to be moving in. I don't want that to happen. Increasingly, but maybe too slowly increasingly, people like me, when they hear a proposal like that, they don't think that. They think, oh yeah, my kids. This is a place for my kids to live. Because I don't know where my kids are going to live, because even if they manage to get an advanced professional degree, they're not going to be able to afford to live in the Golden Horseshoe region. That's the fear that's driving a lot of people today. And I think that fear may translate into a new way of thinking, hopefully in the near future, that we'll start seeing the addition of new people and the next doubling of population in your neighborhood as not being a bunch of strangers moving in, but as the next generation and the kids who are living in your basement right now having an opportunity. So we need to recognize that the next 35 million, 40 million, 60 million Canadians are not just a bunch of people arriving at the airport and coming into town, though they should be welcomed and given a place to live, but they're also the people who are coming into Canada by the more traditional method of being born to us and to our children, and that we should be making plans for population growth, not just for people we don't know, but for ourselves and our own families and our own futures. Thank you very much.